Welcome to The Late Show. It's a very special evening because we're going to be discussing the pagan roots of evolution. And we've all heard the term. We know a little bit about paganism. I think we know a little about evolution. But as we look around us today, and often in The Late Show we're talking about social breakdown and the immorality which is rife around the Western world. So sometimes it's quite good to look at some of the fundamentals, and the fundamental just means foundations. What's the roots of some of the problems we have today? So sometimes we say, oh well, Darwinianism is the root of the problems, certainly in the 20th century. But there are some roots to evolution, and I'm really pleased that we're joined again by Joe Hubbard.
It's good to be back.
Great to see you.
Yeah,
really great to see you.
Last on, but yeah.
And you're from a creation research?
Yes, creation research. I'm the director of the UK branch of it, the international director who, actually, I didn't tell you this, our director John Mackay is now director emeritus.
Oh, that's
good.
He's
He's sort of semi-retired now. He's gone back into just doing writing and research, which is wonderful. He's got a whole host of wisdom to share with us, but he's been on Revelation.
So, knocking on for 20 years ago. I do remember him, and when we met up just now, I said let's have a look at the rocks, because he's famous for his rocks. Now, just to say to folks watching, of course you can contact the websites, but we have live emails tonight, so please email in. And may I just ask, of course you can email on any of your thoughts to do with the subject, but it'd be great if you could reference some of what we're talking about. Now, we also have some of our friends who watch are atheists, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, again, in response to what we're discussing tonight. We normally start with a Bible verse. Is it worth starting with one? Have you got a suggestion?
We can certainly start with a Bible verse. I would suggest, I've got my Bible here, I'd suggest Ecclesiastes.
Okay.
Ecclesiastes, in particular chapter 1, verses 9 to 11, because we're talking about the roots here.
Yep.
Right? We're talking about the roots of evolution. And this is what Ecclesiastes says in chapter 1, verse 9 to 11. That which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new? It has already been in ancient times before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. It's a sobering section of scripture, but it makes an important point. It makes a point that, I mean, bear in mind, this is ancient history, right, when this is being written.
We've definitely come after.
So we've come after this, but even in ancient history, they're saying that people are not remembering the things of the ancients, the things that have happened in the past. And so when we think about evolution, we often have this concept that evolution is a very modern, very scientific idea invented by Charles Darwin, founded on heaps of evidence, and led into the modern sort of neo-Darwinian theory of evolution. But Ecclesiastes,
Charles Darwin, who lived in the Victorian era and who's been deified in our
quite significantly, And we tend to think, oh, this is when evolution started. It started with his famous voyage, HMS Beagle, to the Galapagos Islands and many, many other places. And he started collecting evidence and observations, and it led him to write his book, and that led to a whole load of other discoveries. And we tend to view evolution as this modern scientific idea. Ecclesiastes would disagree. It would say that there's nothing new under the sun, and people have been believing in this kind of stuff for ages. So what I'd like to do tonight is we're going to look at a few, rocks and fossils, but really it's about looking at this ancient view of evolution and where this idea of evolution actually came from.
So just
it goes back much further than you think.
On Darwin, so he's quite well known for sort of speculating on the biological level, but we're going to be focusing, even before biology came, the rocks.
Yeah, well, Charles Darwin certainly is known for focusing on the biological level, but he did do a lot of the geological stuff.
Okay.
And in fact, he was mentored by a man called Charles Lyell.
Yeah.
And Charles Lyell was a lawyer by trade, but wrote about geology, his famous book, The Principles of Geology, right? And Darwin said, my ideas about evolution come half out of Lyell's brain and he's never given enough credit for it.
Okay.
Right? He said that in one of his letters that ended up being published after his death, right? And Charles Lyell wrote predominantly about geology. Yeah. So geology, in particular, what we call deep time, right? Millions of years and even, you know.
But wasn't that a presupposition?
It's a presupposition.
It's an idea. He's a lawyer.
Yeah.
He's got an agenda. Most lawyers do. And so what was he a noted scientist of his day? And of course, what evidence was there?
Yeah, yes and no in terms of noted scientist. He was a lawyer by trade, but then there was no such thing as a scientist by profession like we think of today, other than a doctor. Yeah. And so you'll find most of the natural scientists of the Victorian times and before are predominantly either one of three professions. They're either doctors, as in medical doctors, they are either lawyers, because you're rich enough to be able to fund your own discoveries, or you're the clergy. You're a member of the clergy, right? So many of these people are reverend doctors who are the ones who are doing this kind of science. But Lyell is coming from a geological perspective, and the geology, the deep time perspective, is what directly influenced Darwin when it came to thinking about evolution and thinking about how he could develop this. And by the way, Charles Darwin wasn't the first one to have ideas about natural selection and evolution. His grandfather wrote about it.
That's right.
So his grandfather Erasmus Darwin believed that we'd all evolved from the shells, right, out of scallops. Yeah. And so he had basically been borrowing his grandfather's ideas, which go way, way, way back, much beyond his own time, right? And so that's where we need to sort of start and progress backwards. But we need to understand that when it comes to things like, we often think, oh, modern scientific idea about deep time. Well, the idea about deep time, millions of years, it existed long before any dating
ancient
method.
times.
Absolutely.
So let's have a look. Let's dig into it. By the way, we'll do a big chunk, maybe of 20 minutes or so. Then we'll take some emails, and then we'll do another chunk answering the emails. But let's see how we go. Let's try and get through this idea of where are the pagan roots. So are we going to start with the Sumerians?
Yeah, well, let's go back to the first reference to deep time. Okay, deep time is basically a reference to millions of years and vast periods of time. So the first reference to deep time comes from the Sumerians, the ancient culture in the Middle East around famous, of course, Genesis 12, out of God called Abraham, okay?
Quite significant.
Quite a significant area. The ancient Sumerians had basically a record of what they called the Sumerian King List. Yeah. It's known, abbreviated as SKL. So if you go to it was in the British Museum a few years back. I think it's now in the big museum in Oxford, the Ashmolean Museum. Right. But you can go and see it. Now, the SKL, the Sumerian King List, is interesting because it records the fact that the ancient Sumerians believed in a creation account, a supernatural creation account. They also believed in a worldwide flood. And they believed that in between the creation account and the worldwide flood, there were a number of kings, what they called the pre-flood kings. And these pre-flood kings, these 8 pre-flood kings, can be correlated quite well to the 8 pre-flood patriarchs, right? Adam to Lamech, right? And then to Noah. So you've got a correlation there with scriptural history. And it shows you that the ancient Sumerians believed in real events like a real creation, 8 pre-flood kings / patriarchs, global flood. They even believed in a tower and a Babel and a confusion of languages. And you can correlate this with other ancient cultures, the Babylonians as well, right?
So far that sounds as though it sort of fits
sounds like
with our account, but isn't it the sort of epochs or the ages?
This is where they changed, okay? Yeah. Essentially, what you have is you have a culture. Now, cultures throughout history inherently have been racist in the sense of, I like myself better than I like you. It's got nothing to do with skin colour or anything, really. It's
very dangerous when you get scientific racism.
Yes, that's a whole other... Yeah, exactly, yeah. And that really built up with Darwin. But effectively, you have the Sumerians there, and they're going, we want to prove that we are the oldest and therefore the greatest. Now, you see this trend all the way down through history, but it starts with the Sumerians because rather than... I mean, you read in the scriptures, the patriarchs, right, the pre-flood patriarchs, they're living, some of them almost to 1,000. Right, Methuselah 969. Right. But they are still being succumbed to the ultimate cause of the curse, which is death. Eventual death. But the Sumerian King List exaggerates.
Death now.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other political topic.
Nothing to do with shortening life. It's all about shortening death.
Yeah. Well, that's they want gas chambers back now. But yeah, that's the whole thing. But the Sumerian king list is effectively now exaggerating these pre-flood kings / pre-flood patriarchs. So all of a sudden, in the Sumerian king list, you have tens of thousands of years, not just 1400 to 1600 years, like you read about in Genesis between creation and the flood, but tens of hundreds of years in this period, with some of these kings living several thousand years at a time, right? So there's an exaggeration. There's
exaggeration,
a manipulation,
or just plucking numbers out of the sky.
Partly plucking numbers, but it's also not. It's also precise numbers, because the Sumerians effectively became the Assyrians and the old Babylonians. And by the time you get to the Babylonians, there's one figure called Berosus. Berosus was the chief priest of Marduk. That's another tangent we could go off, right? The ancient gods and idolatries.
Don't tempt
he was he was the chief priest of Marduk. And he wrote a book called Babylonica, the history of the Babylonians, right? So this is now a little bit later than the Sumerians. Now, the Babylonians worked on what is known as a sexagesimal system. It's in multiples of 60. If you ever wondered why we have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour, it's because the Babylonians worked on a base 60, right? So we work on base 10 generally, metric, right? Old Imperial, base 12 or base 16. Babylonians base 60, right? So it was a sexagesimal system. And so they believed that the cosmos was basically a multiple of 60. So we've got the exact numbers here. Berosus claimed that there was an additional 1,680,000 years that had happened before the Sumerian king list. So being between creation and the Sumerian king list. He argued that between the flood to Alexander the Great was around 36,000 years, so far greater exaggeration. He predicted that there'd be a further 12,000 years of history, which brings the total cosmos history, according to Babylonian, you could say mythology, right, or
Millions
cosmology, to 2,160,000 years, which is a multiple of 60. Okay? Now, this is significant because this is the first reference to multi-millions of years in history. And it came about, and Berosus admitted it himself, he was wanting to make Babylon the greatest that had ever existed. I mean, you read about the pride of Nebuchadnezzar, right? And God even having to humble him.
So that's part of it.
It's part of it. The Babylonians were
aggrandizement.
Exactly, extremely proud. And so all of a sudden, well, if we are the oldest culture, therefore we are the greatest culture, therefore we are the most significant culture, therefore, well, hang on a minute, we have references to millions of years and belief in millions of years. Long before Charles Darwin or any modern dating method, right? Any radioactive, radiometric dating, long before all of that, we have a belief in millions of years.
Okay, so we understand their agenda. We'll talk about Lyell's agenda later, but there are other cultures, aren't there?
Absolutely, So we see influence. So, for instance, we see influence from the Babylonians to the Hindus. Now, we see this because there's little things, right? Like, for instance, one of the Babylonian sort of Middle Eastern Phoenician gods, Baal, the half-bull god. Well, what creature is sacred in India? It's the cow.
That's right.
Little connections, you see. And you can be walking down through, Hindu temples and you see a great big Greek statue of Atlas. Well, what's he doing there? Well, Alexander the Great went there. And so there's a lot of interaction between these cultures. And so the Hindus go even further. The Hindus believe in this sort of reincarnation, over and over again. And they have effectively exaggerated the 2 or so million years from Babylonian cosmology. In Hindu cosmology, you're talking about over 3 trillion years, all right? The cosmos god Brahma.
But they do have a beginning, do they?
They have a beginning and they have an end, but it's over 3 trillion years, right? So that's beyond anything that our minds can really fathom. So again, billions of years in a pagan philosophy, long before any kind of so-called scientific philosophy. The Hindus and the Babylonians influenced the Greeks, just as the Greeks influenced both of them. And the Greeks is where it really starts to sort of hot up, because now we have references not just
We've come a long way, by the way. We've come how many million years to the Greeks? So the Greeks are sort of 400 BC.
Over and over and over.
Okay, so we're, don't worry, folks watching. We're actually getting up to, the modern day. But thanks for, I can see a few people emailing in. Don't be frightened. Email, if you want to say anything on what we're talking about, go for it.
So you find that the Greeks are now heavily influencing the Hindus, particularly around India. You even see this in the caste system. The undesirables at the bottom. Who's at the top of the pile? White man. And even today, the most common beauty product in India is face whitening cream. That was a system introduced by Alexander the Great. Like the white man. So there's all these interesting little social connections all the way through. But the Greeks, the philosophers, right? They sit around, they think. And so they are the ones who are sort of taking this to the next step. Now the Greeks started with effectively...
Just jumping in here, you know, the fundamental issue actually isn't scientific evidence, it's a philosophical presupposition. So we're sort of building up, as it were, the backstory of this presupposition.
And also following how different cultures are influencing each other, right? Not just on the social level, but even on the scientific level. And so the Greeks, which started off as a very polytheistic society, okay, many gods, and their gods were just like us, but bigger, right? So if we could create things, they could create bigger things. If we could get angry, they could get really angry. If we could play tricks, they could play bigger tricks. And in fact, there's a discussion about fossils to be had there and what the Greeks believed about fossils. But towards the end of the
one
Greeks,
of the 7 wonders of the ancient world is that big foot.
Yes.
So in other words, we can create an even bigger
even bigger thing of it.
And that foot can be in our mouth.
And these gods as, you know, so much greater than us. But you've got this sort of a digression down, because by the time you get towards the end of the Greeks, certain sects of Greeks, like the Atomists, for instance, which is a certain group, a certain sect of the Greeks, they start to move away from a polytheistic philosophy into a more naturalistic one. One where they believed the Earth had existed for vast periods of time, tens of thousands, if not millions of years. They believed that life could arise spontaneously. They believed that given enough time, creatures would go on to produce what they called hopeful creatures. These hopeful creatures would be able to survive better than other creatures, and as a result would develop new features and pass on their offspring.
Survival of the fittest.
It's survival of the fittest, natural selection. This is Darwin's theory of natural selection long before Darwin, right? They also believed that they had evolved out of a slime. And it was a racist version of evolution, because they believed that they had evolved out of better quality slime than the Jews had. Right? This is in their writings, right? Many of the writings, including Plato and the like, it's all there. So you've really got this very early natural selection philosophy based off of this idea of hopeful creatures. And so the Greeks really had a very significant view of evolution, one that we would even recognise today. And there was a book that's now out of print, but it was published in the early, sort of mid-1800s, very soon after Darwin, right? And it was basically called From the Greeks to Darwin. And it recognised how Darwin had taken his influence from the ancient Greeks. And so we're like, well, hang on a minute.
Conveniently forgotten.
It's been conveniently forgotten.
Debates.
But you know, we can follow this all down. In fact, I'd like to, if it's all right, just briefly bring
just to say, as you're getting up into the Victorian, I've got a book of 3 volumes on my shelf called The Living Races of Mankind, and you can't believe how, you know, the fact that you've got a beard is sort of proof that you came from the monkeys. And they'll have extreme versions.
Honestly, there's a book that again we've got the original of it actually, and I'm not going to say the name of it because you'll probably be taken down off the telly, right?
Oh yeah,
it's quite serious, but it's basically talking. The concept is a dark-skinned person, is a black man. Are they made in the image of God or not? Right, and it's full of racist stereotypes and all sorts of stuff. But it basically starts, and this is the really interesting thing, right? When it comes to racism in this Bible, right? It starts with, we know that Darwin's theory of evolution has been proven. And so now it leads on to which of the human races are made in the image of God. Well, only those descended from Adam are made in the image of God, and Adam was obviously a white man because he was the best. And white men are the best.
Exactly.
And so it's
really insidious the way it comes into the church.
And it's taking a pagan philosophy and fitting it into Scripture, and then twisting Scripture to turn it into something that justifies what is effectively gross racism, right? But I just want to bring in a bit of the concept, because you see, when we're progressing through this with both the ancient Greeks, right, and philosophy and stuff, you have this influence of ancient Greeks down throughout history. A pagan influence. And you see this perhaps most abundantly, plus you see where Christianity comes in as well in saving us from that philosophy, in fossils such as shark teeth. So if it's all right, I just want to show you a couple
that's what I wanted to do, because 20 years ago I did this with, and I started asking John Mackay questions, and funny you should mention that, and he grabbed something out of his bag. So now we're getting into the rocks.
John has trained me well, right? So I've got a couple of fossils here.
Is that a stalactite or a stalagmite?
It's neither. It's from an animal, actually. It's a shark tooth. And it's a pretty big shark tooth. This is a real one, by the way. This is a copy. This one here is a cast of one, but it's a cast of a...
Have a look at this big one. So the big one that we got on the screen now, that's the... what do you call that?
So this is the megalodon. Literally just means big tooth, right? Now, it's supposed to be around 20-odd million years old. Okay. Now,
how many?
20, around 20 million years old in the Miocene. I don't believe it's that old, and we can get more into that a little bit later.
Is it because you don't believe, or is it because there's sort of pretty strong evidence that it isn't?
Well, certainly the evidence comes into it. I would say that my authority, and I make no bones about it, my authority is the scriptures, right? And so I start with the scriptures and work backwards. But something which we try and make a point of in creation research is reminding people that there are many, many, many different ideas, theories, opinions, and hypotheses that contradict every single part of the Bible. The facts never actually do.
That's right.
And so we can explore more of this and talk about maybe some radiometric dating in a bit. But the philosophical...
I mean, the point why I said belief is because they have a belief.
Yes,
that it's however 20 million years.
Well, it's all about how you interpret the evidence.
Yes, that's the point.
We have the same evidence. It's all about how you take that and how you interpret it, right? Exactly. And these shark teeth are great, right? These are enormous. The megalodons, right? This is a small one. It's the one that I take around.
There you can see when we did the close-up, you can see its serrated edge.
Absolutely.
It's literally designed
pretty
for going through the meat.
Several hundred of these in the mouth, right? It's gonna do some fairly serious damage. But the interesting thing about these megalodon teeth, well, number one, they are big. Modern day ones are much, much smaller. Now, the megalodon teeth are identical pretty much in every way to the great white shark. In fact, for many years, it was only recently that they've been evolutionary categorized as a different grouping, but for years they were categorized as the same grouping, Carcharodon.
So you've got in your other hand, that's... From
this one's from a mackerel shark. It's about the same kind of size as a great white shark. This is just a cast of one, basically. But much, much smaller, as you can see.
Yes.
Right? And
so it still looks pretty nasty if that
still pretty nasty. But if you go to the Houston Museum of Natural Science in the USA, they show you a model of megalodon, which is 20 plus meters long, right? Next to a great white shark, which is around 6 meters long. And they tell you, look how much sharks have evolved. And you're like, sorry, you're using the wrong word here. Sharks haven't evolved, sharks have devolved. They've gone from very big to very small, complex to simple. That's the opposite of evolution. Yes. Does fit in with what the Bible says, because the Bible says everything that God made was very good. Man sinned, the world was cursed, and the world went from good to bad to worse. Right? It's been going downhill, degenerating, devolution all the time. But the reason I bring these fossils up is quite important. You see, the ancient Greeks knew about these fossils. Not quite the giant megalodon, but they dug up shark teeth out of the rocks. And the Greeks, being a very logical people, they said, well, hang on a minute. Sharks live in the water. They don't live in the rocks. So how did these teeth get in there? Well, the Greeks said, well, clearly we have a worldview that believes in many, many gods. So obviously the gods put these in the rocks in order to play tricks on us. That's it. Right? They call them tongue stones because turn them upside down, they look a little bit like our tongues, right? Now that was a 100% logical conclusion. Yes. It just happened to be 100% false. But the Greeks...
Logical, but also connected to a belief.
Connected to a belief. What you believe about the world that you live in and what you believe about history, exactly, it'll change the way that you study the world. So the Greeks believed that these were tricks. The Greeks influenced the Romans. Romans influenced most of the West. And all down throughout history, through the Middle Ages, people believed that these were just tricks played on us by, well, not the Greek gods by this point, because this is Roman Catholic England, right? But by the devil. They believe that these teeth were tricks played on us by the devil in order to get us to doubt God's word. So how did we go from this pagan, evolutionary, naturalistic view of the world, where these were tricks played on us by gods and devils, to believing that these are actually shark teeth? Well, the answer is a man called Nicholas Steno. Nicholas Steno was a monk.
This is your last... the last reference before we look at some emails.
Absolutely, because it's a really important one to kind of, well, not finish on, but round up this section on. Nicholas Steno was a monk. Nicholas Steno believed in the Bible. Nicholas Dino believed when it said that God created in the beginning and everything was very good. He also believed where it says in the scriptures that God is a God of law and order. He particularly believed Romans chapter 1, verse 20, where it says that God has stamped his nature onto creation so that man is without excuse and we can trust the world. So Nicholas Dino said, and this is a bit of scientific jargon for you, right? If a substance is exactly like another substance, not only to the regards of the conditions of the surface, but also the inner parts and particles, then it can be rightly assumed that it is like that in manner of production.
Yeah.
That's a whole load of scientific jargon to basically say, if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck, guess what it is? Right? It's a duck. Right? So his argument was, if this looks like a shark tooth both inside and out, it is a shark tooth. And that revolutionised science because it opened us up to a new branch of science called paleontology, the study of fossils. And it started because one man started with scripture and not the pagan roots of evolution, the Greeks. Okay? So far...
That can be applied to so many fields of science.
Exactly. So just before we've started with the Sumerians, an exaggeration of several 100,000 years. We've gone to the Babylonians, an exaggeration based on the Sumerians of several million years. Gone to the Hindus, several billion years. Greeks incorporating all of that and also incorporating a naturalistic philosophy very similar to what we understand today to mean evolution. And now we're at the point where the Greeks have influenced all of the Middle Ages, and we're starting with people to come back to the Bible and revolutionize science. Right?
Great.
So that's a good place to stop before we carry on.
Let's have a look at, it's just a few emails because we always scare people with you know, saying, can you answer or can you comment on what we're discussing? But here we go. This is from Simon saying, has the establishment always been anti-God? Question mark. Charles Lyell said with defiance on the Bible there should be no reliance. He spent all his days working out ways to separate Moses from science, which we're going to get to later. But let's have a look at that question. Has the establishment always been anti-God? Now, of course, the establishment was once the church.
Well, yes.
Running everything.
This is the thing. And even the church, as in we're thinking Middle Age church, right? Even the church had pagan influence. We see that with the Greeks, right? And what they were, you know, believing in the church. I mean, it's the Roman Catholic Church, right? There's going to be some paganism in there somewhere, and that might be a little controversial for some of you.
We see
but
it.
That's the reality of it. Interestingly, that comment about Charles Lyell, we'll get onto this a bit later, but Charles Lyell influenced Charles Darwin very heavily. He was basically, Charles Darwin was basically Charles Lyell's most faithful disciple. And Charles Darwin said, towards my latter days, I have come to realise that the Bible is no more to be trusted than the sacred works of the Hindus. Right? In other words, he equated the scriptures as pure mythology.
That's right.
The same as you know, any kind of other pagan writing.
And if you start with that, you've already got a shroud over your reading of Scripture.
Well, what's interesting is just a week ago, I was in Poland. Lecturing to a group of, it was organised by a group of evangelical Christians. Pray for Poland. There's only about 5,000 evangelical Christians in Poland, right? But we'd been organised. It was me and Professor Andy McIntosh that went out there. I think he's been on the channel before, and we were lecturing to a group of churches and stuff, including to a group of a big conference, to a group of particularly academics, right?
Can I interject? Because Andy McIntosh does some brilliant lectures, and one was on the human ear and how evolutionists say that it's the same as the crocodile jaw, you know, the three tiny little bones that we have in there, which they obviously can't be because of their size.
And crocodile jaws don't listen to anything either. It's quite, you know.
Anyway, carry on. What did you say?
One of the lectures that we gave, I shared with Andy, was how the Reformation advanced science. Now, with this question about the establishment, that's quite important. Because the establishment today certainly is anti-God. The establishment before, the Roman Catholic Church, while you couldn't necessarily call it anti-God, it was heavily influenced by pagan thinking, and it ultimately quelled a lot of scientific investigation. The Reformation allowed science to run. Unfortunately, it also got rid of an establishment, rightly or wrongly, probably rightly, but it got rid of a closed establishment which also allowed for the rise of atheistic principles and anti-God.
And just while you mentioned the church, as it were, the early church fathers, we were talking earlier about Augustine, Origen and others. Just where were they on this? debate.
So the theistic evolutionists, the people who promote that God used evolution, they like going to the church fathers because many of the church fathers used and studied and wrote on Genesis, scripture, the beginnings, as a real deep theological essay. Now, there's no doubt about it, there's an awful lot of theology to be got out of Genesis chapter 1, right, about who God is, what he's like, and so on and so forth. You see that thread all the way down throughout Scripture. But just because these church fathers wrote about the theological implications of creation doesn't mean that they didn't believe that it was literal, right? Even to the point where even some of the strongest theistic evolutionists today, Dennis Alexander, for instance, he has to admit that Augustine of Hippo believed in a young earth, six-day literal creation, right? One of the more significant
it's a classic example of deducing or extrapolating or exaggerating, without the evidence.
Exactly, And so what you'll find is the majority of the early church fathers, as well as the reformers, believed in what we would recognise today as young earth creationism, right? 6 literal days, a few thousand years ago, made by God. Now, many people will say, well, hang on, there was no concept of evolution back then, so there was no such thing as young earth creation. Well, the reality is, as we've shown, belief for millions of years certainly existed, and the Greeks believed in a version of evolution, and you see this in some of the church fathers' writings. So here's a quote from Theophilus of Antioch, right? He lived, 115 to 180 AD. He said this: creation occurred 5529 BC, give or minus 200 years, not the tens of thousands as Plato and others have written. So here we have an early church father, early-ish church father, countering the Greek philosophy about millions of years and saying, no, we have the scriptures here. In fact, Augustine said that we know that not yet 5,000 years have passed based on the Holy Scriptures.
And he saw the conflict there. Can I read some more now?
Of course.
They're not all with questions. This is from Paul and Ruth. Evolution is a false teaching. Since when did we see a half monkey or half man? It's totally rubbish. By the way, we don't hold back, our views, as you probably know. A butterfly has always been a butterfly. Never has there been a gradual change, except when it goes from a pupa.
Well, even then...
That's one of the most marvellous things.
It is, and even then, it's not an evolution because the caterpillar... In fact, you can go back even further than that. The egg, which is laid by the butterfly, has all the information that's required to turn it into both a caterpillar, a chrysalis, and a butterfly.
Yeah, that's right.
It doesn't gain any new information, it doesn't evolve any new information. It already has the information and the hardware to be able to actually do that.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. A lot of theology in that one.
Yes, well.
But we can't go there. And anyway, just finishing our final line, the animals led into the ark are no different than they are today. I'll keep going, read a few more. There are, actually, this is your follow-on, Paul and Ruth. There are gods, but there is only one God above all gods. Paul referred to it to the unknown one, which he revealed to the church. That was interesting because Paul, of course, was there in Athens talking about the fact that they knew deep down, and that there was an element of honesty there. Deep down, they knew that there was this inexplicable, elements to our life, and Paul was able to open up what that was.
And Paul went back to creation.
Correct.
He said, let me tell you about this God. First things first, he created everything.
Yeah.
So you can forget about your other puny gods. This is the creator God. And he came to die for you. So he went from creation to the gospel, which is a great way of going about it. It gives you the full story, the full picture.
And now Arnie writes, they say evolution is science. So let's do a scientific experiment. They say in the beginning there was nothing and then it exploded. Okay, let's take nothing into a lab and try and make it explode. What came first? An anonymous writer says, the chicken or the egg?
You want an answer to that?
I don't know whether I do, but go on then.
Well, I'll give you a biblical answer. The chicken came first.
Yes, thank you.
Seriously, day 5, God created flying creatures.
Of course.
Right? It didn't create eggs. And by the way, that's the opposite of what evolution says. Evolution says the egg came first. Some scientists managed to deduce that, apparently.
Yeah.
It was in the newspapers a little while back. No, Genesis chapter 1, day 5 of creation, let the earth bring forth flying creatures.
Yeah.
Birds of the air.
I'll read this as we've started at Ecclesiastes. Les has got some more from Ecclesiastes. It tells us that God is a God of timing. There is an appointed time for everything, and there's a time for every event under heaven. That's Ecclesiastes 3:1. Many think that in their own time they can turn to God, but his time is the right time. Jesus wept over Jerusalem, saying, "You did not recognize the time of your visitation," Luke 19. A group of Israelites decided to try and possess the land of Canaan the day after God told them the opportunity had passed. Understanding God's timing is one of the keys to taking the proper action. The sons of Issachar understood the times, and this gave them insight as to what Israel should do in Chronicles 12. See, we're not just talking about rocks, but there's a rock in front of you, which maybe we should have a quick look at.
Sure.
Because this is one of the contradictions, isn't it? That
is.
Evolutionary dating has.
It's a little rock. It's a knobbly rock. It's a piece of lava, basically, a piece of basalt. Mm-hmm. Now, this was collected by us, by Creation Research. It comes from a place called Kapelahu, which is on the Hawaiian Islands. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, it's interesting because it comes from a particular volcano at Kapelahu, which we have 3 different dates for.
Okay, that's helpful.
Well, if you collect
the Sumerian date, the Greek date?
Well, it makes an interesting point because it shows us that there was a belief in millions of years, long before the first dating method was actually invented, right? And the dating methods themselves, almost all of them anyway, I'll tell you one exception in a minute, but almost all of them are based off of the preconceived belief in evolution in millions of years. Yeah. A little bit of advice. If you ever get into a debate with an atheist or an evolutionist, a really good question to ask them is, can you give me any evidence for evolution that doesn't presuppose that evolution happens?
Yes.
Now, 90% of the time they'll go, eh? Because it takes a bit of brain power to think through, right? Yeah. But you'll find that almost every piece of evidence that they point to for evolution presupposes that evolution happened, and they are interpreting that evidence with an evolutionary mindset in mind.
Okay, let's keep looking at
this rock. Go back to this rock, okay? So we've got a lovely piece of rock here from Kapelahu, from the volcano. Yeah. Now, if you date this using potassium-argon dating, it gives you a date of up to 2.4 billion years. Yeah. Okay? If you date this using helium dating, it gives you a date anywhere between 140 million to 670 million years. Yeah. The third way you can date this is you can go to the island and you can ask the people who were there at the time, because this volcanic eruption happened, according to the eyewitnesses who were there, in 1801. So this is less than 200 years old from when it came out of the ground, supposedly full and fresh of radioactive material, ready to start decaying, and according to the dating methods, there is so little radioactive material in here, which there shouldn't be if it's fresh rock, that it's either 2.4 billion years if you use potassium argon, or 140 to 670 million years if you use helium dating.
Okay, let's dig into this, because just explain the basics. This is a science late show. Just explain the basics of the decay of, if it's potassium argon. What's actually happening? And how can an element decay?
So we're going to try and put this in as simplest terms as possible, okay? Yeah. So this is not going to be scientific language. Mm-hmm. But effectively, you've got something like potassium, other types of dating is uranium to lead or whatever, and you get variations of that.
Stop there, because everyone knows what uranium is and lead is. How can uranium turn into lead?
So if you start with uranium, you get a variation of uranium, like uranium-247, which is very, very unstable. It's unstable because it has too many electrons, right? Yeah. Too much energy whizzing around it, right? We think nuclear, we think energy, right? Yeah. So what you've got, all this energy, and that atom wants to find stability. That element wants to find a stable nature. Yeah. And so it naturally bonds with other things, finds other things in the environment to bond with and to break down. And one of the things that it breaks down into is to lead, right? So uranium, which is known as the parent, breaks down, decays into lead. So you have the parent element, which is uranium, the daughter element, which is lead.
Lead is quite stable.
Lead is very stable.
Lead is used, as it were, to cover over radioactive material.
And to defend it. So it's a very, very stable, very strong. It's already, come from uranium, if you like, right? It's a very, very stable material.
Potassium argon in this case.
The same case. Potassium breaks down. Potassium is the parent. It breaks down into argon, okay? And what you have to do is, well, it's important to note that there's no machine in which you put this in and it spits out a date at the other end. What you do is you put this into a machine usually a form of mass spectrometer, and it'll tell you, it'll very carefully measure the amount of uranium, or in this case potassium, right, and the amount of argon that's in it. Yeah. And it'll give you a long string of numbers which gives you all of the information. Now that's real science. Yeah. That's real information, that's real data. You're literally just reading what's inside the rock. And there's very often very little contamination because it's a very easy, relatively simple process. You're just measuring what's inside there. What you then have to do is you then have to interpret that information. That's where the millions of years comes in. Yeah. So there are various stats, tests and things that you put in, but ultimately, in very simple terms, you have to make a few assumptions. Number one, you have to assume that this rock had the most amount of parent material in it that it could possibly have. Most amount of potassium. You also have to assume that there was no uranium in there to begin with whatsoever. Yeah. You also have to assume that the decay has been consistent, that there's been no outside influence. We know that various outside influences
like a volcanic explosion or something.
Yeah, a volcanic explosion.
Melted and then
there was a case where, you know, the single volcanic explosion, you mentioned this earlier, went into the sea, and the sea began to affect the way that it cooled, and that affected the amount of parent-daughter ratio.
Now, what I want to do is just unpack, because you're not really allowed to question the motives of scientists, but you know, they've got 3 dates. You know, one is the oldest. Which one are they going to choose based on, you know, their career prospects in the modern world?
Out of this case, they would reject all of them, and they would try and get the paper that eventually got published about it cancelled. You can still go and find the paper, but there was attempted to take it down and discredit it many times, but it still hasn't been discredited yet, simply because we have an eyewitness for this. Now, in another case, if you didn't have an eyewitness for when this was formed, right, what you would do, I mean, put it this way, if I took a rock to a scientist, or you brought a rock to me if I was a secular scientist, right, and I've done a number of these experiments in laboratories, the first thing that you do if you say, how old is this rock, is you would be asked, where did you get it from? Now, we need that context because we need to know where we assume that age of that rock before we even test it. In other words, we already know how old we think the rock is going to be before we even test it. And this is the testimony of a scientist, a geomorphologist called Ron Neller. We actually have a creation research interview with him. I'd recommend it. It's fascinating.
So it's on your website.
It's on our website, creationresearch.net. There it is, yes. It's an interview, it's Flood or Folly, an interview with Ron Neller. Fabulous testimony, right? Where he came to the Lord basically through finding evidence of the flood. But one of the times that he began to reject, or certainly question, this idea of millions of years is when he took a sample in to be tested. It gave him 10 different dates. And he said to the head researcher, well, which one are we going to use then? We've got 10 different dates here. And the answer was, we'll use the one that gets published. In other words, we'll use the one that fits with our preconceived ideas about how old the rock actually is, right?
That's outrageous.
Now, that's the reality of it. Carbon-14, now
By the way, how long ago was that?
Oh, this was about 20, 30 years ago.
Okay, so that was before. What everyone knows is what they call fake news. So, you know, an alternative facts and your alternative reality. And that's the problem we've got today, actually, is because we know people's motives. Everyone's sort of waking up to the fact that people's motives aren't pure. And so even scientists, they have an agenda.
Well, that's what we mentioned earlier, right? There are many ideas, theories and opinions that contradict every single part of the Bible, but the facts never actually do, right? And so what's the lesson to be learned from this? Go with the eyewitness account, right? That's the lesson to be learned. Well, when it comes to things
I learned a lesson because I grew up in Sussex near a place called Piltdown.
Oh, yes.
And when I heard the story of this guy, he was committed to an evolutionary view, and all his life in the end as a scientist, and then he filed the bones to fit his arguments.
Well, that point about eyewitness, right? It's a important point because we have an eyewitness account here.
That's right.
In the scriptures, right? The God who was there, who told us how he did it, is actually the one who was the eyewitness to it and the one who recorded what he did that we can trust. So there's a little, I suppose you could say, philosophical or biblical point to you there, but yes.
Can we read? We've got another Bible verse, and then we might have, and we'll comment on that, and then we will do some more of your emails.
Yes.
Shall we have a look at the Peter?
Peter, yes. Well, we've gone down through history, okay? We started with the Sumerians, Babylonians, Hindus, and now we're at this kind of point where science has had a revival. Because of the Reformation, because people believed in the scriptures, science has had a revival. And this happened all over, right? Newton, Kepler, right? Kepler said science was thinking God's thoughts after him. Well, a few years ago, the science teacher said that scientific theories are references to aspects of nature without any reference to God. So how did we go from science being thinking God's thoughts after him to all of a sudden science having no reference to God whatsoever? Well, Peter says some interesting stuff. If we go to 2 Peter chapter 3, in particular it says it references in verse 3, right, there will be scoffers will come in the last day, walking according to their own lusts. Yep. And in verse 4 it says this, saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. And it says in verse 5, for this they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water. Verse 6, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. But the heavens and earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and the perdition of ungodly men. So a bit of a warning towards the end there, right, about the judgment of fire. But look at what these scoffers are going to be doing. Number one, they're going to be denying 2 significant points. They're going to be denying the creation, and they're going to be denying the global flood. Now, this is quite important.
And to try and avoid the judgment.
Yes. Now, this leads us on towards Darwin, but there's one more connection that we need to make, okay? We're now in reformed society, right? Reformation has had a boost of science. Science has exploded. But then the French get involved, and things begin to go downhill. And I don't mean that facetiously.
No. I couldn't possibly comment on that.
The French have a revolution.
Yes.
What's their revolution about? Well, the revolution is they want to get rid of the monarchy. Problem is high Catholic France. If you question the king, who you believe that God has appointed, which by the way is a principle, a biblical principle, then that's double treason. You're questioning God and you're questioning the king. So, what's the French revolutionary solution? Get rid of God.
That's right.
And so writers like Voltaire, de Buffon, de Maillet, they wrote things, these sort of French revolutionary philosophers, which included things like fossils are inorganic, just like the Greeks believed. They said that a global flood was impossible, just like the Greeks believed. They said that life could evolve spontaneously and slowly evolve over millions of years, just like the Greeks believed. Now, this was done in order to get rid of God, therefore you could chop the king's head off, right? But interesting little social history, right? English and French don't always get along. No. English and Scots don't always get along. Scots and English historically have got along quite well. And so the first ideas of these, what we call uniformitarianistic ideas, the idea that the present is the key to the past, that the world is uniform, that if you see a little tiny river slowly eroding away a gully today, boy must it have taken a long time to erode the Grand Canyon. Right? That's the philosophy. Exactly. And so people like James Hutton introduced this concept from France to the rest of the world, in Britain particularly. People like Charles Lyell, the Scottish lawyer, we mentioned him earlier, right? He wrote the Principles of Geology, influenced Darwin. Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, believed we'd evolved from the shells. And so all these ideas are now starting to come together. The
present is the key to the past.
It's the philosophy.
They read into the present, and extrapolate their past.
That's the philosophy that comes into it all, right? And Charles Darwin then goes on the voyage. He makes some observations about change. He says if a little bit of change can happen over a short amount of time, therefore a large amount of change can happen over a large amount of time. And we know there's been a large amount of time because of Lyell's theories.
So hold that thought just there. And Deborah writes, hello, a bit of water over a long time or a lot of water over a short time. She's talking about the Grand Canyon. What does the science prove on the Grand Canyon?
Okay, well, it's interesting.
I've got about half a dozen or more emails, so not too long an answer.
What's interesting is, again, if you go to the eyewitness accounts, all right, the ancient Indians or Native Americans of North America record in their stories the fact that they heard a massive bang and the canyon appeared as ice dams broke in the north and rushed down, right? And there's a lot of evidence, morphological, geomorphological evidence, that you had a huge lake system up in the north, right, on the border of Canada and the USA that burst its dams and rushed down through and carved out the Grand Canyon, right, after Noah's flood, basically. So I'd encourage you to go to our website, look up more. We could go through loads and loads of information, but excellent. The evidence is there was a lot of water.
That's very interesting. John says, I'll read a few in a row actually. A dromedary beetle has always been a dromedary beetle. If not, it would have been eaten up. And let's just go to this one. This is just someone called Tim. My name is Tim. But for information, I am a Roman Catholic, but I am drawn to watch Revelation TV at every opportunity.
Excellent.
Pleased about that. Debs writes, as there's nothing new under the sun, history repeats itself. Do all religions have some truth? It seems to me things are being revealed today about the Roman and Greek gods, and they might have been half-breeds of the fallen angels and humans. This is the classic example of, taking another subject in, but enhanced superpowers, question mark. As nothing new, perhaps man creating man in his own image as a cyborg half-breed with human and technology with AI superpowers. Will history be repeating itself? You could shoot a robot and might fall down and then stand back up again. Does this sound like something out of the Bible? I don't get the learning from this show, but it is interesting and more revelation of history. Evolution is a theory. The word theory says it all. What's the main message of tonight's teaching? I'm not getting it. Actually, you wrote that quite early on, Deb, so it may be that you're getting it now. This is from Rose. I love listening to Joseph talking on evolution. When I was growing up in Cornwall, I was fascinated by sparkly rocks in the wall on my walk to school, and I've been interested for the last 60 plus years because there is so many different stones, rocks just in our immediate environment. I believe the scientific view that the Earth was millions of years old and it made the rocks seems even more exciting. Since I became born again, my thinking did a literal 360 degrees, and I found, well, 360 degrees takes you back to where you started, so probably 180. And I found I could not believe the findings of scientists anymore. I was rebooted to fully grasping that the Earth is young and that there was a worldwide flood. All the evidence is obvious to me, and I'm not a scientist, just a mortal with an immortal brain. From Rose.
Yeah. Very good.
And one more. This is from Stephen. The current evolutionist teachings, as depicted in today's educational materials, teach Earth as being millions of years old by pointing to the Cambrian layer or Cambrian period. But many paleontologists disagreed with Charles Darwin when he first published Origin of Species. You've been mentioning that. Because the Cambrian layer reveals many species fossilized, get my teeth in, compared with other so-called Earth layers prior to this period. I believe that the Cambrian explosion simply supports the sudden appearance of species on the Earth through God's initial creation week, but who were then wiped out by the flood in Noah's time, where species were rapidly mummified.
Essentially, and the Cambrian explosion is that interesting point, is suddenly you appear enormously complex. Every phyla of animal that exists today appears there in the fossil record from nowhere at the Cambrian explosion, with no real explanation as to where they came from.
But also not this sort of gradual appearance of all of these, according to Darwin's tree.
They also stay the same until they go extinct. So we talk about living fossils, right, creatures that haven't evolved, but you still see the concept of after their kind, like you do in Genesis 1. Even in creatures that aren't living fossils. So ammonites, for instance, they apparently existed on this Earth, according to evolution, for about 360 million years. They appear from nowhere. They haven't evolved into ammonites. They stay ammonites for 360 supposed million years. Then they go extinct. Now that's not evolution, right? Even if you want to make them 360 million years.
One of the largest known, hanging out of a cliff outside my house, a chalk cliff. Now we've got 5 minutes. I want to dig into how this influences our world today.
Let's see if we can as well try and get to that point of what's the big point of this program.
Exactly.
Okay, get there. Okay. Well, we left it off with Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin. Okay, Charles Lyell basically took the French revolutionary ideas, which were based on the pagan Greek ideas, which were based on the ancient Hindu and Sumerian and all that kind of stuff, this ancient pagan idea about millions of years in evolution. He said, we are going to view the world in a particular way, through uniformitarianistic ideas, right? The present is the key to the past. That directly influenced Charles Darwin. Charles Lyell got rid of the Bible. Charles Darwin rewrote the Bible, right? That's the way that it works. Now, where did Charles Lyell get his opinions from? Where did he get his passion from? Why did he promote the idea of millions of years in evolution. That's the really agenda bit, right? Now, thankfully for us, his sister-in-law, who was a Christian and a creationist, published Lyell's letters after Lyell died, in which in multiple cases he admitted what his agenda was. Quote unquote, my aim in promoting millions of years, deep time, evolution, right? My aim, quote unquote, is to free science from Moses. Okay, Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Psalm 90.
And the framework of God's law.
The framework of God's law. Now, what do you get in those first 5 books? Creation, fall of mankind, judgment of mankind at the global flood, history of mankind at the Tower of Babel, law of God. What happens if you get rid of those 5 things? Well, if you get rid of creation, you've got no creator. You have to explain creation some other way, so perhaps it can happen naturalistically, which means that there's no creator who has a say over us. If you get rid of the origin of death, then you get rid of, well, death is now just a natural part of life. There's no consequences for sin because there is no such thing as original sin. There's no need for Christ. I mean, if death is just a part of natural creation, then what did one extra person's death mean in the cross, right? So you get rid of an accountability there as well. If you get rid of the judgment of mankind at the global flood, not only do you get rid of a huge amount of Earth's history, and we could spend hours talking about geological evidence for Noah's flood, but most importantly, you get rid of a God who can judge, a God who has judged, a God who has a right to judge, and a God who's promised that he'll judge again. And if there's a God like that, he might have a few rules we ought to be following. If you get rid of the Tower of Babel and the history of mankind, you have no answer to why are there different skin colours? Why are there different eye shapes? How do we explain all the races? And so you're left with a very racist view of evolution, which Charles Darwin promoted, which is if you have a different skin colour than me, or like you said, if I have a big beard, then you must be less evolved than me. And it caused devastation.
In the last century.
Okay? And if you get rid of the law of God, you have no basis for morality whatsoever. You see, Charles Lyell knew what he was doing as a lawyer. He said several times, he said, if ever Mosaic geology, in other words, science based on the Bible, was going to be put aside without giving offence, in other words, without people realising it, it would be done in a historical sketch. In other words, sketches in TV sketch, it would be done by rewriting what history has taught us. Right? He had an agenda, and the agenda was to get God out of people's thinking. And by doing that, we have ended up in the place where we are today.
Brilliantly complete programme, Joe. The point is, it's still an ongoing story, this degeneration of, you know, and very dangerous thoughts that are being introduced to kids, because once you start with a faulty logic, there's no end to the faultiness of that logic, which is affecting society in a big way today.
Once you reject the truth, any lie becomes believable.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll leave you on that thought.
I think Goebel said that. So, John, you're going to get the final thought. On evolution, I like to point out that no mutation produces an increase in information. Rather, mutations are at best neutral, normally detrimental. Thank you very much for that thought. We don't have time to discuss it. And thank you to everyone. Thank you, Joe.
It's been wonderful.
The pagan roots of evolution.
I look forward to going with you next time.